We were talking about Paul on the third missionary journey last time. When Paul left Berea, he came to Athens and he sent Silas and Timothy. It's a little confusing in there, putting together what is said in Acts and what is in Thessalonians. But apparently, Paul was in their company when he first came to Athens, but he thought better of it. He sent them back to work and to try to strengthen the church in Macedonia. How long Paul was in Athens is not clear. It may have been a couple of weeks or a couple of months. But there was some point when Paul decided that he was not making much headway at Athens. Athens was not a principal city among the Greeks in the New Testament period. It had been when the Peloponnesian Wars came along. Athens led a coalition of Greek cities against Sparta and its coalition. So there was a time when Athens was a very important place. But Athens lost that war, the Peloponnesian War, and Sparta became, for a time, much more important than Athens. Athens built a wall from the city down to its port city, Piraeus, and so they could travel, they could walk back and forth from the city down to their navy. The Athenians were famous for having a great navy in the ancient world, or in the world, say, for 200 or 300 years before the Apostle Paul. Well, Paul, it isn't clear, it doesn't say in Acts, just how he got from Athens to Corinth. He may have walked down to Piraeus, taken a ship. That would have been the easier way. And if he had taken a ship, it would have gone to what we call Cenchrea. The classical scholars call it Kenkrea. And so he would have landed there and then walked maybe the 4 miles or so from there to the city of Corinth, where he was working, where he wanted to work, where he was starting to work. On the other hand, Paul may have walked the entire distance. It would have been a rugged uphill, downhill walk if he cut across the Isthmus of Corinth, if he walked across there from Athens to Corinth, but he may have gone that way. When he would have ended up at about the same place if he had gone foot or if he had gone by ship. He would have ended up in Kenkrea, and from there had to walk across to Corinth. On the way, he would have passed the great temple, which in the ancient world, by some of the people, was compared, the temple, to Poseidon, the sea god, at Corinth, where the Isthmian Games were held, was compared to the temple to Zeus at Olympia. It was one of the great temples of the world. It was torn apart largely by the people of a later generation who were trying to protect themselves from invaders. But there was a time when there was a great temple of Poseidon there where the Isthmian Games were held. The Isthmian Games, incidentally, is our terminology, not theirs. There isn't any inscription, any place where it names those names. Corinth was in charge of them. But speaking of Corinth, during the time of Paul, like I said, it was a principal city, a much more important city in terms of trade, commerce, and culture in the Roman world than Athens was. Athens sort of lived on its laurels out of the past. It was a great city because of some of the people that had lived there. But it wasn't particularly well known. It wasn't particularly a center of trade like Corinth was. When Paul got to Corinth, the first people that he encountered, or a people that he encountered shortly, he first of all, you can imagine him trying to look up the synagogue, asking people from people around where the synagogue was located, and he found some people in the synagogue, and he preached in the synagogue. Aquila and Priscilla were Jews that had lately come from Rome to Corinth. Now, there is something extra that we know, extra to the Bible that we know about why Aquila and Priscilla would have been in Corinth. The Roman historian Suetonius, who lived about 100 and between 100 and 105 A.D., wrote a history of Rome, which he called the Lives of the 12 Caesars. And he says when Claudius was the emperor, that Claudius had been mad at the Jews because of riots they had caused in the city of Rome. Now, that is not so unusual, except that he mentions what the riots were about. They were at the instigation, Claudius says, where Suetonius actually records it. He says it was at the instigation of one Christos. And you can see that Christos is very close to Christos. Was Suetonius just confused? Was the rioting really because the Jews had differences of opinion about this Christ and whether or not the Christ had come? But he actually spells the name Christos, not Christos. Now, Christos was a fairly common name too. One complication leads to another. But Christos means kind, and so many slaves were named Christos by their master. And so it may be that the rioting was really around an individual by the name of Christos. But he could have been confused, and the rioting may have been over Christos, instead of Christos. And so there's a lot of confusion on that. At any rate, Claudius made all of the Jews, and at that time, being a Christian was just being another name for being a certain kind of Jew. And so they probably suffered by their association with the Jews when Claudius told all of the Jews to get out of town. And so apparently Aquila and Priscilla came to the city of Corinth. It is interesting that Paul nowhere mentions Aquila and Priscilla in terms of his converting them to Christ. Apparently they were Christians when Paul met them. He does at times speak of the first fruits of Asia or the first fruits of Achaia, people that he had converted first when he'd come there. Demetrius at Athens or Damaris were probably the first fruits of his efforts in Athens. But he never calls Aquila and Priscilla. He never gives us reason to think that he had converted them to Christ. They may have already been Christians. But Paul, it so happened, knew something about the kind of trade that Aquila was in, being a maker of tents. Apparently, he dealt in leather somehow, and it may have been that he made tents for people who came to stay at the city of Corinth or in the environs of Corinth when the great Isthmian Games were going on. And so Aquila and Priscilla raise their own questions because of some evidence that we have outside the Bible. Paul stays in Corinth for a year and a half. The leader of the synagogue, the first man in the synagogue, is converted to Christ, and there are other Jews who are converted, but of course some of them are not converted. And so Paul at Corinth always has something of a problem with the Gentile-Jewish mixture in the church there. It's sort of in the background, in my opinion, in the letters of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and to some degree in the book of Acts. You might remember that when Paul was at Corinth on the third journey and wants to leave there, the Bible says that he learned of a plot that was against him, that they were ready to kill him on the ship. And so he had to go back a different way. So I think that background, Jewish Gentile convert, in Corinth was particularly severe. and Paul had to deal with it not only while he was there, but after he left there when he wrote them letters and so forth. Well, Paul worked with Aquila and Priscilla for a time, and it was the practice of synagogues that they often would build a sort of guest room on the side of the synagogue. So Paul may have, the Bible says that he stayed there with Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue. He may have stayed in the guest room that the that the synagogue had. But in time he had to leave there. The Jews turned against him. And Paul was, some of the Jews that disliked Paul, that believed that he was an impostor, some of them took him and before the Roman proconsul, a man by the name of Gallio. Now Gallio makes for another interesting connection between the city of Corinth and Paul during the time that Paul lived. Gallio, there is an inscription at Delphi. Delphi is not too far away from Corinth. And they kept on stone there a record of the city of Corinth and of other cities around. And we know from records from a stone that's been found there that Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia, that he began his term 49 or 50 AD. Well, you see, that would have been right around the time that Paul would have been there. Any place that you read a chronology of Paul's life will have to take that into account, because Gallio, we know that Gallio was proconsul in Achaia, and we know when he was. Now, it is likely, and you see I'm speculating a lot here, but it is likely that Paul would have been brought before Gallio early in his rule at Corinth. And the Romans had a habit of their regular practice was to appoint a person like Gallio as the proconsul of an area of Achaia in Greece, to appoint him for a 1-year reign. So you see, we know about when Gallio would have been proconsul of Achaia, and we know that Paul was taken before Gallio. And it was probably during the early part of Gallio's tenure. You see, I mean, the Jews would likely have wanted to resolve this issue as quickly as they could. And so presumably it was when Gallio came on the job, shortly after he came on the job. That's the way it happened in other places. That's the way it was with Paul, for example, at Caesarea. When Festus became the governor of that region, Festus was not a proconsul. He was not as important a person as Gallio would have been. Gallio, incidentally, was a brother to Seneca. I don't know if you know who Seneca was, but he was a very important philosopher, is to this day in the Roman world. He ruled virtually for a time when Nero was emperor, and Nero at one point told Seneca that he was tired of him and wanted him to kill himself. He wanted Seneca to, and so Seneca killed himself. There are easier ways to die than to die at the hands of the emperor. And so Gallio had Paul taken before him, and Gallio, I expect, found out that Paul was a Christian. He knew something about the name Christian by that time. Knew that the Christians were associated with the Jews. And do you remember what Gallio said? Something on the order of, if this is a matter of Roman government, Gallio said, I'll take care of it. I'll be the judge. But if this is a matter of you Jews squabbling over your laws, handle it yourself. And so Gallio, they beat Sosthenes, and the leader of the synagogue, in the front of the proconsul of Gallio. And so presumably Gallio said, that Jews and Christians, I'm not going to make a distinction between them. They're one people. For a long time, that's how people thought of Christians. Christians were basically Jews that had some peculiarities in Jewish thoughts. And so, for a time, there was no sharp distinction. That, of course, that whole thing as to when the synagogue and the church broke with one another, we are pretty close to the time when the Jews break out and revolt against the Romans, when the city of Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 A.D. That war began in 66, and so we are getting pretty close to that time when Paul is working with the church at Corinth. Well, the Gallio is another connection that there is between Paul and his stay in Corinth and what the Bible has to say. Now, Corinth at the time that Paul lived was a thoroughly Roman city. It had been established by Julius Caesar. The year that he died, Julius Caesar established 2 colonies. One was at Corinth and the other at Carthage. And so it was during that time that he established Carthage and Corinth as colonies. What he did, what Julius Caesar did when he started that was sort of to set in motion a practice that the Romans were to practice for many years. There are several colony cities in the New Testament, but only Philippi is called a colony. Corinth was in fact a colony, and Lystra and Iconium were in fact colonies too. So there are several colonies in the New Testament, but Corinth was one of the earlier ones. There is an inscription found in the theater area of Erasmus, and that too makes a contact between Paul's stay in Corinth and Roman government. There was a person named Erastus. Erastus is a fairly rare Greek name. And so, is it the same Erastus? In Romans 16, a Christian sends greetings to the Roman church whose name was Erastus. Paul says that he was oikonomos. The word is translated in a lot of versions as treasurer. That sounds like a very important person. But the word in Greek can mean an important person or a non-important person. It's not clear. When Paul says that he was oikonomos of the city of Corinth, many translations have that as treasurer of the city of Corinth. Well, whether he was treasurer or not, whether the Erastus of Romans 16 is treasurer or not, is uncertain. But the person who put down a slab of pavement, a part of the theater, in his own name, bragging about coming into office as an aedile in the city of Corinth. An aedile was a very important Roman position. And so if this man was an aedile, he was a big shot. But he came into government at that time, and he lays a pavement for himself in the theater area at Corinth. You can see that today if you ask to see it. The guide may or may not take you down there. But that inscription of Erastus is still in its place. It's clear, though, from what is there now, that it used to be larger than it is now. It no doubt was fancy, brass letters put in it and so forth. But Erastus may have been an important person in Corinth. If so, his being converted to Christ is significant. In other words, it wasn't just poor people that were converted to Christ, though I expect that most of them were. But there were also people, particularly people from a Jewish background who had been there for some time, there were people who were well-fixed, well-to-do, who became Christians. And Erastus may have been among that number. There is, in Acts 19, I think it's 18 actually, there is a place where Paul sent away a man named Erastus, a Christian, and Timothy to prepare things for him in Macedonia before he got there. Well, you might remember that there was a riot by the silversmiths, and Paul had to, his schedule was all bent out of shape by the circumstances, by things that had taken place in Ephesus. But eventually he came back to the city of Corinth, and so Paul made 2 trips that are recorded in the book of Acts. A 3rd trip, I think, while he was at Ephesus, that he came to Corinth and tried to straighten up matters that were there. But Paul had a terrible, terrible job on his hands trying to keep the church in Corinth on the straight and narrow. Now there's just a few verses, maybe 10 or 12 verses, that are given to Paul's stay at Corinth in the book of Acts. While he's there, Silas and Timothy come back. They rejoin Paul. And so Paul, Silas, and Timothy work for a time. It's not clear just what part of the year and a half that Paul spent there. He spent in company with his friends, Silas and Timothy, who had come there. But he decided to go back to Jerusalem to meet with the church there. And so at the end of the second missionary journey, Luke handles it in just a summary fashion. He says that Paul went up and greeted the church, presumably at Jerusalem, and lets it go at that. And so Paul came back to Antioch in Syria, and began the 3rd journey from there. But Paul's stay at Corinth was a very important stay. A powerful, a strong church came into being there. It was one of the centers of the ancient world. Julius Caesar reestablished it as a Roman colony in 44. But for 100 years before that, Corinth had been demolished. It hardly existed. There were a few squatters that came in the city, but the city of Corinth hardly existed for about 100 years before it was established as a Roman city by Julius Caesar. And so you can see why when the Romans came as colonists, there would have been very little Greek influence in the city of Corinth during the time of the Apostle Paul. All the inscriptions from Paul's time, for example, are in Latin, not in Greece. And there are a lot of inscriptions because the Isthmian Games were sponsored by Corinth, and many people came to the city for that purpose. The Isthmian Games were actually attended a lot better than the Olympian Games were. But the Olympian Games had the advantage of oldness and reputation. And one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was in Olympia. And so it was a lot more famous place than Corinth was. But anyway, that's Paul's stay at Corinth. He stayed there a year and a half, and then later on, he stayed there. The book of Acts says that he wrote Romans. He was that. Well, you can put together the book of Romans along with what Acts says, and put Paul in Corinth when he writes the letter of Romans. But that's on the 3rd journey, sometime after he established the church there in Acts chapter 18. So I hope this has helped you a little bit about Paul's stay in Corinth. There's a lot more to say. I was just complaining to Whitney. I've studied Corinth so much that I could talk for a couple of hours on any one of these things. Aquila and Priscilla, for example, or the Erastus inscription, or Gallio and what Gallio meant to the city. You see, there are several places where the history of the Roman world touch Corinth at about the time that Paul was there. And so there's a great deal to learn. Corinth was a city of great wealth. It was a city of great poverty. What little is said in the ancient world by the authors of the ancient world about Corinth, some of it is you would really feel sorry for the people that are there, and some of it you would think that everybody in town must have been rich. No doubt some of the people were like Erastus. There was a place for them to assemble on Sunday, but there was also problems at Corinth that dogged Paul during his whole lifetime. Thank you for your attention.